Worst of All Time. The true story of Regency actor Robert Coates. So, we're right in the middle of making a video documentary, but frankly, at this point, it's an open question whether or not it's ever going to get finished. Docs aren't cheap to make, and so far, we've yet to find a suitable backer. So, at Janet's suggestion, Janet's my partner, we've decided to make an audio doc, or a blog, I suppose, a record of the making of our story. Might as well start when I first meet Mr. Coates. We're in London, England, and it's 1825. You heard me, 1825. How it got to be 1825 and why Robert Coates, I'll get to later. But first, a brief setup. So, dear listener, try to imagine me standing in a small but elegant house in the fashionable district of London. 34 Craven Street, the Strand, to be specific. Standing on my left is Linda Henderson, my camera operator, and my friend since university. She's really good at bridge, and even better as a videographer. On my right, slightly out of breath, is Janet Singleton, who humorously likes to call herself multi-talented, but it's actually pretty true. She looks after makeup, lighting, sound, and even research. Actually, she loves doing research, and she's always reading. We also share a house and bed, which only makes sense if you're trying to make a go of it in Toronto. And then there's me, Fred Pruitt, documentary film director. Linda tightens the screws on her tripod and says to me,
"You do realize Robert Coates is a pretty darn unreliable narrator."
Well, yeah, that goes without saying.
But he should be entertaining.
I'm holding a cup of tea in my hand. Not because I like tea, God no, but because in Regency London, that seems to be the boisson du jour. I put down my cup. Honestly, Linda, if half the stuff Janet told us about this guy's true, this footage is going to be gold. Sundance material for sure.
England's worst actor. Is that really our working title?
I move closer so Mr. Coates can hear me. He sits in an ornate Regency-style morning chair. Can we get you anything, sir? Another cushion?
Yeah, I'm most comfortable, Mr. Pruitt. How could I not be in my own lodgings and with a cup of the Viscount's tea in my hand?
Viscount, right. But mostly we're interested in your story, Mr. Coates. So just relax and tell things in your own words.
Whose other words should I choose?
What can I do but smile and bite my tongue? I get the feeling there's going to be a lot of tongue biting in this project. I turn to Janet. Makeup okay?
Would have been nice to remove some of his makeup.
Janet rolls her eyes. I think it's her favorite gesture.
But it seems Mr. Coates is extremely particular about his personal appearance. Actors, you know.
But what about the hat?
No way we're going to get him to remove the hat.
He might as well be wearing a goddamn sombrero.
I particularly like the foot-long white feather sticking up in the front. It's very cinematic.
Janet likes to complain that she's underpaid. I remind her that we actually did make money in our last project. Not much, but some. And what about this time-traveling gig we've stumbled upon? How can you put a price tag on that? I'm sure Linda feels undervalued too. Anyone in the biz, probably. As for me, turns out my main job is to keep everyone in my crew happy. It's all about public relations, not film directing. Anyway, I'm straying from the central story. Back to London we go. Mr. Coates, shall we begin? It's important for you to picture just how Robert Coates puts down his teacup. He does it with precision. In a way I can't imagine anyone from our century doing. He does it as if he's handling a precious artifact. And maybe he is, for all I know. Then, what Mr. Coates likes to do is cross one leg over the other, setting into prominent view his diamond-studded knee buckle. It takes a moment for him to get settled, as if he's looking for the chair's sweet spot. Then he brushes back a strand of his hair, which I'm pretty sure he's dyed to hide the gray.
How do I look?
Tremendous, Mr. Coates. I turn back to Linda. Final check. Battery fully charged?
100%.
What about those diamonds? Are they going to be a problem?
I'll just shoot him from the waist up.
I do not mean to disoblige you, Mr. Pruitt, but before we begin, the purpose?
At this point, Robert Coates is waving his hand in the air, making a small spiral like some third-rate actor searching for a line.
The purpose of this, what is the term you used?
Documentary?
Just so. The purpose of this documentary is, what, precisely?
The purpose is in the word, Mr. Coates, to document your life, to make a record of your achievements, your passions, what you would like the world to remember about you.
You speak of creating a document, sir, yet I see among the three of you neither paper nor pen.
That is the beauty of it, Mr. Coates. With the device Miss Henderson, Linda, is operating, everything is recorded automatically. Your words, your gestures, your resplendent attire.
And I may hope that all my reminiscences will then be immortalized in a book?
A book? Possibly. We'll definitely look into it. Remind me, Linda.
Oh, I will, Fred.
After all, Mr. Pruitt, what man of letters, in which category some would deign to include me, would not wish to have his thoughts inscribed on the page for posterity? Can you think of any who would not?
No, you've got me there, Mr. Coates. I offer a big directorial smile at this point, which, on most sets, would clearly communicate it was time to move on. But Mr. Coates is either oblivious or impervious to such body language. The point I'd like you to keep in mind, Mr. Coates, is that Miss Henderson's camera here can record much more than mere words.
Mere words, Mr. Pruitt? Whenever were words mere?
Point taken, Mr. Coates. And we value your words very highly indeed. And when we're done, you'll be able to watch your own words and image reproduced just as they were when we interviewed you.
Works of the devil, surely.
Only if the devil has taken on female form.
Not in the least funny, Mr. Pruitt.
If not the devil, the work of the French, I wager. Possibly Lavoisier. You've heard of Lavoisier, Miss Henderson?
Linda's an amazing videographer. But when it comes to general knowledge, let me put it this way. She isn't the first one you choose to have on your pub quiz team. Janet, however, is a different story.
Lavoisier, French chemist. I believe he was guillotined in the end.
Alas, so. Or perhaps it was the work of Mr. Davy and his galvanism. Disgraceful showman, but quite clever, I suppose.
The ladies used to swoon while watching Davy's experiments, and sometimes sent him their calling cards.
Oh?
Wrapped in undergarments.
I wonder what Mr. Coates makes of all this. We profess to be American, so I think he makes allowance for our foreign accents and questionable dress and manners. All the same.
I was once invited to one of Mr. Davy's lectures.
I watch as Mr. Coates pulls a handkerchief from his pocket, wiping from his shoulder something only he can see.
Did not bother to attend.
Next, Mr. Coates opens a snuff box.
I believe the man is dead now.
God, snuff! Can you believe it? Mr. Coates, what is it they say? Time waits for no man.
Tempus fugit.
Exactly. So I beg you to just trust the process. Try to forget that Miss Henderson is there. And that device on the end of the boom that Janet is holding, that's meant to record your words so we can hear them better. You should ignore that as well.
Should I speak louder?
Your voice is perfect, Mr. Coates, just the way it is.
I've been told so by many, but dare not profess it myself.
You have a magnificent voice, sir, and stories to match, I'm sure.
I do have one or two anecdotes I might share. Are you quite sure, Mr. Pruitt, that we have never met before?
Well, what can I say to that? I ignored the question.
Rolling.
So, Mr. Coates, I understand you were born in the West Indies.
Indeed, sir. Born to parents Alexander and Dorothy on the island of Antigua.
But your father was actually born in America, is that correct?
In the British colonies, yes.
Even with just one studio light, which in retrospect I'm sorry we bothered bringing, the room is broiling. I have to keep wiping sweat from my forehead. And yet you've spent most of your life in England. That makes you very cosmopolitan.
Forgive me, Mr. Pruitt. Cosmo, what?
Well-traveled, a man of the world.
Ah, I see. Some might say so.
Why don't we start with your time on Antigua? What was it like growing up there?
Little to tell, Mr. Pruitt. Put succinctly, it was hot. Sugar cane everywhere, as well as Negro workers and servants.
Here, Mr. Coates smiles and drums his fingers across his armrest. Not a good sign.
I stayed only until I was 8, then off to England and boarding school.
Before leaving, we show Mr. Coates a small sample of our filming. Linda points to her monitor.
That's you, Mr. Coates.
It cannot be.
Don't you recognize your lodgings, your clothes?
I'm so small.
All this started 2 weeks ago when Linda comes traipsing through our front door with the camera slung over her shoulder. Where the hell have you been? We were supposed to be in Mississauga half an hour ago to interview what's-his-name.
I've been to London, Fred.
What?
London.
What are you talking about? When? London, Ontario?
England.
Come on, Linda. Car's in the back.
Not so fast, Fred. I have to show you something.
Maybe later, Linda.
Guys, please. You promised. Let me show you.
Your video camera time machine? Really, Linda? So what? You just power up, go to your menu.
Don't touch it, Janet. It's not a toy.
Geez, take it easy.
We're not going anywhere till I show you.
But when Linda gets into one of her moods, we have no choice. So we stand there like idiots with tiny pellets of snow blowing in our faces.
So I know this works for one person, but maybe it has a limited range. Maybe if you, I don't know, hold on to me or something.
Like Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Present?
Just do it.
So we do it. We link arms and turn our backs to the wind. If it wasn't for the ice pellets, I'd be rolling my eyes.
Anyway, so I scroll through the options and I pick one just to see what'll happen. London. Then it's time to test the image quality, so I hit the shutter button and boom.
Boom? You're in London?
Yes! Like this.
And before you can snap your fingers, there we are, in the middle of Trafalgar Square. My God. There we are, staring at the freaking National Gallery. I can see red double-decker buses rounding a traffic circle, and the black taxicabs, everything. And I'm thinking, maybe we won't go bankrupt after all.
And then when it's time to go back, I just set the location button back to Toronto and voila!
And instantly, we're back in the freaking wind and snow. Janet and I just stand there for a good minute, our eyes big and our mouths hanging open. What about Paris?
Mais oui.
Sydney, Australia?
Behold.
We're looking out over the harbor and the Sydney Opera House. Holy shit, I remember saying, we were supposed to start filming a documentary about Paul Carson, a famous Canadian Shakespearean actor.
So what now, Fred?
Well, we can forget about what's-his-name. And that's how it all starts. Back in Toronto, no one wants to cook, so we order in some Thai. I crack open a beer and pour my co-workers the traditional Chardonnay. So you say you got the camera from Craigslist?
Yeah, from some creepy guy over in Parksdale.
Creepy how?
I don't know, swarthy, old, quite short now that I think about it.
A leprechaun, then.
No, Janet, not a leprechaun.
How do you know?
Jesus, Janet! It's hard to believe, isn't it? It's so simple. You just have to scroll down to the date, time, and zone settings and pick a location.
I guess memory is a kind of time travel too, and thinking back to the events of 2 weeks ago seems just as strange somehow as thinking back to our stay in London 2 centuries ago. Let me explain. After a little fiddling around with the camera's menu, we discover, to our utter amazement, that not only can we pick a geographical location, we can pick a historical date as well. That was a game changer. We spend the evening reviewing the first day's filming. Technically, the footage is flawless, but the content is disappointing. Mr. Coates remembers very little of his childhood in Antigua, and as far as his English schooling goes, He summarizes his experience as quite adequate.
Tough interview.
The only time the man gets excited is when the topic of theatre comes up. It's in London, he explains, that he first becomes exposed to the stage, viewing firsthand some of the greats of the English theatre. After completing his schooling, Mr. Coates returns to Antigua, where his first order of business is to join the local theatrical society. He shows little interest in the day-to-day operations of his father's sugar plantation. That part I get. But the hours he spends rehearsing and performing, including his first experience of Romeo and Juliet, Mr. Coates remembers very fondly. You played Romeo?
I did indeed, Mr. Pruitt.
At which point Mr. Coates rises from his chair and explains he has a prior engagement, which pretty much puts a wrap on the day's filming. Linda expects every dinner to be followed by dessert, but all we have are wagon wheels, which have been in the freezer for God knows how long. This is no deterrent to Linda, who doesn't even wait for them to thaw before biting into one. We turn on the TV. Jeopardy is on, and Janet keeps answering the questions before the contestants press their buzzers.
What are the cascades? What are gamma rays?
I've always been skeptical about the notion of a sugar high, but watching Linda, I'm having second thoughts.
Can you believe we have a friggin' time machine, Fred?
I nod. I can't decide which woman I most want to ignore.
I mean, I thought it was cool enough that we could beam all over the world like that, but to be able to travel through time as well. And again, so simple. Just have to adjust the time-date function.
What is a quokka?
Just think of the possibilities, Fred. Still, I have to say I was a little surprised we started with Robert Coates.
I was surprised too.
When we could have had some other famous dead actor. Who was it Janet mentioned? And I guess we could have even done Shakespeare, and maybe we still will, right, boss?
Who knows? It was a mistake to pat Linda's hand earlier, because now I have chocolate all over my fingers.
Then out of the blue, Janet suggests Robert Coates. I've never even heard of him. The world's worst actor. I mean, what a concept!
I noticed the final Jeopardy question has just come up on the screen.
In the 15th century BCE, this city was regarded as the capital of the Minoan Empire. 30 seconds, good luck.
The music countdown has hardly started when Banshee Janet does it again.
What is Knossos?
There's $46,000 American dollars that will never fall into our pockets.
We should go
To Knossos?
to Antigua. Get the scoop on young Coates firsthand.
Linda's in the kitchen looking for another wagon wheel.
Antigua's not on the list of locations. I checked, Janet.
Well, somewhere close then.
There's Kingston, Jamaica, but...
What about your GPS? Couldn't you just... Linda returns with her second wagon wheel. She puts a hand on my shoulder as if to say, Poor Fred, you just don't understand these things.
The GPS, Fred, just gives your current location where you're shooting. You can't set it.
Have you tried?
Well, no, because
But we all know Janet is never one to give up an idea easily, so Linda takes out her camera.
Just for you, Janet, one more time.
So it is scrollable.
Apparently.
Fantastic!
Okay. But if we're going to do this, we really need to know exactly what we're doing. We don't want to end up in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean or inside the back wall of some, I don't know, bakery somewhere.
Death by baguette. Could be worse. Seconds later, Janet has already brought up Google Earth on her phone.
St. John's, Antigua. Got it. I'd best put us down somewhere that definitely would have been undeveloped back then. Here we are, on a hilltop. Mount Thomas. 17 degrees, 6 minutes, 49.86 seconds by 61 degrees, 52 minutes, 59.75 seconds.
I start rummaging through a drawer looking for shorts and T-shirt. What year should we pick?
Let me see. Robert Coates is back in Antigua by 1788 for sure. We already know he's joined the local theater group by this time. But wait a second. Listen to this. Lord Nelson makes a brief stop in Antigua in 1805.
The Lord Nelson?
Yeah, the one-armed, one-eyed hero of the seas. We just saw his statue back in London. So what do you say, guys? July 1805?
I hold up my T-shirt. Emblazoned on it is a picture of 3 colorful palm trees, plus the words, One Love, Jamaica. Why not, I think? But Janet clamps her hands firmly on her hips.
Seriously?
It turns out Antigua is not a jungle. In fact, it's quite dry, and Mount Thomas is only a hill, not a mountain. Happily, there's a path that leads into St. John's, and we arrive in town mid-afternoon.
Whoa! Lots of sugarcane.
The proprietor of the local inn is the first white person we meet.
Welcome.
He says welcome, but his body language says something else. Both Janet and Linda have wisely hidden their gear in large handbags.
Just arrived.
He looks like an ex-pirate. No parrot on his shoulder, but he is missing a front tooth.
I did not expect another ship this day.
Private charter. Just in from Jamaica. We're here to see Mr. Coates, actually. Alexander Coates.
We're old friends.
Acquaintances.
And you've come all the way from America?
Exactly, sir. Looking to arrange a trade deal. So much cane out there.
Up the hill. Big White House. Just follow the crowd.
The crowd?
When Lord Horatio deigns to make an appearance, what would you expect?
Right, Lord Nelson. We heard he was in the Indies.
Not that you Americans would have much affection for the man. Nor do any of us, if truth be told.
We begin a long but gentle climb up the hill. Sugarcane shoots high into the air as far as the eye can see. Almost as numerous are the sweating men who are cutting the cane, bundling it, and throwing it onto carts.
So all this belongs to the Coates family? And all these workers, are they...
Slaves, yes. Alexander Coates is a slave owner.
I notice Linda slowly reaching into her handbag, and I'm about to say something.
Don't even think about it. Regency London is one thing, but we know nothing about the rules or etiquette in Antigua. We need to keep a low profile.
But think of it, guys. Actual, authentic footage of slaves working in a...
No! Several dozen people stand outside the big White House. They're all white-skinned and white-apparelled. A half-dozen soldiers sit on steps, looking bored. Suddenly the soldiers step to attention, and one of them barks out an order. Out of the big White House's double doors emerges the man of the hour himself. He stops briefly to look back at his hosts, makes a quick bow, then descends the stairs. The crowd titters. One woman appears to faint, but is immediately and gallantly caught.
What was that?
Had to be.
Shorter than I expected.
Like his nemesis. And no, Linda, you can't film him either.
Very quickly, Lord Nelson and his entourage descend the hill and are soon out of sight. We wait for the crowd to disperse, and then we make our move. A black servant meets us at the door. We're here to see Mr. Coates.
We knew the younger Mr. Coates back in London.
Did I mention it's hot? It's bloody hot. Sweat is dripping down my shirt. What I'd do for a cold beer at this point. We wait as the servant disappears into the dark and enticingly cool interior.
What's keeping him?
Here he comes.
Please, follow me. Alexander Coates is dressed to the nines and sitting at the edge of a fine embroidered Chesterfield. He is a portly man, but Jenna tells me this was more or less a sign of prestige at this time. He keeps a cane close by, and he has a silver tea set in front of him.
You have me at a disadvantage, sir. Alexander Coates.
So good of you to meet with us, sir. Fred Pruitt.
What brings you and your lovely companions to our fair island?
For courage, I steal a quick glance at Janet, who is the principal author of this scenario. I'm simply her puppet. I think I already mentioned that my acting abilities are no more than mediocre. But, as Janet pointed out, you can't undo the patriarchy in one day, and Alexander Coates was never going to conduct business with a woman, even one as formidable as Janet. So, the truth is, Mr. Coates, we're here mostly on a whim. Business brought us to Jamaica initially, but then we heard word of the rich sugar plantations in Antigua, and naturally the name Coates came up, a name I well knew. Even more serendipitous was the intelligence that a schooner was about to depart for this island.
Very nice, Fred. Serendipitous, intelligence, very Regency.
The feedback emboldens me. And we simply couldn't pass up the opportunity to beg passage because...
Because Mr. Pruitt is acquainted with your son, sir.
You know Robert?
I do, sir. We went to school together. Long time ago now.
But surely you're American.
Like Robert, I was sent to boarding school there.
Ah, I see. Dorothy, friends of Robert are here from England. Or should I say America?
Predictably, the five of us all sit down for tea. Hot tea. It doesn't seem to matter. We're in the tropics. I hope you'll forgive our dress, Mr. Coates. The truth is our trunks were stolen just before we set sail.
I must say, Mr. Pruitt, I do find your dress somewhat peculiar, but I suppose I have not really kept current about the fashions in America, or England for that matter. I depend on Robert for such things. But I am afraid you have just missed Robert. Where did he say he was going, Dot?
The usual place, dear.
Even on this auspicious day?
If it had not been Lord Nelson, dear, I doubt Robert would have made an appearance at all.
Acting, you see. I'm afraid our poor little Robert cannot seem to stay away from a troupe of local thespians. What is it they are preparing, Dot?
Othello, I believe.
Ah, well, I suppose these little diversions are harmless enough.
Mr. Coates, do you mind if I ask you a question?
Not at all, my dear.
I'm afraid I have a rather curious nature.
Here, Janet titters, the only time I have ever heard her make such a sound.
Would it be possible, Mr. Coates, to share the purpose of Lord Nelson's visit?
I'm afraid, my dear, I'm not at liberty to share the details of our talk, but what I can say is we were most honored by the Admiral's visit, brief as it was. We go back a long way, you understand. Lord Nelson and his ships first came to the Indies. When was it, Dorothy? 20 years ago? He stayed a good long time.
Long enough to marry a local.
Indeed, Dot. Indeed. Miss Fanny Nesbit of Nevis, a most eligible young widow, though I am not sure that really worked out in the end. Mainly, Lord Nelson, not yet a lord back then, was sent to, what would be the word, discourage trade between our islands and America. Of course, I am from the colonies myself, so I can see both sides of the question. Nevertheless, I am an Englishman first and foremost. Nothing too good for our English sailors.
You've been extremely generous, Alexander, to your detriment.
And of course, who wouldn't do everything he could to be rid of that scoundrel Bonaparte?
Nelson? Bonaparte? A sugar plantation? And slaves? Was any of this real? It must give you much comfort, sir, to have your son to help with the plantation.
Robert? Help? The boy cares not a whit about cane sugar, which I must say distresses me endlessly. A plantation cannot run itself, and I am getting on in years.
And then there's your gout, my dear.
Our only son.
Now, dear.
Sadly, Robert has always been a dreamer, with grand ideas and no notion how to bring them to fruition. When he came back from school in England, he declared suddenly his wish to purchase a commission in a regiment of the Guards.
Terrible idea.
But I soon squelched that plan, Mr. Pruitt. Had him do a tour of America instead, and then Europe, once things had settled down there a little. Kept the boy busy and away from politics and daft ideas, but then he discovered the theatre.
At least there he is safe.
True enough, my dear.
No one's making eye contact anymore, and I really can't think of any follow-up questions when suddenly Janet elbows me. Is there a problem, Janet?
Just don't forget. Mr. Coates, is there any chance we might meet Robert before we leave?
Oh, heaven forbid you should not. I'm sure the boy would be devastated to miss a reunion with his old school chum.
Well, you say Robert is busy with rehearsals, which I fully understand. Unfortunately, our ship departs first thing in the morning, so if it's not possible...
Stuff and nonsense, sir. We will have a man lead you to the rehearsal hall forthwith. I'm certain Robert wouldn't mind in the least being interrupted. And after all, too much Shakespeare can't be good for a fellow. Certainly never was for me.
We're led back downhill to a shady little cottage that seems constructed almost entirely of bamboo or cane or some combination of the two. There are voices inside. Actors.
Please, you have to let me take some video.
Only if you can be sneaky about it. A dozen or so actors mill about the hall, and the scene is surprisingly familiar. Amateur theatre at its finest. Not in quality necessarily, but as for good intention... The atmosphere's cheerful and dangerously democratic. No one stands out as director. It's a happy free-for-all. The only rule in place seems to be mutual admiration. I see much patting on the back. Robert Coates, in his younger iteration, walks up to us.
Oh, indeed, Mr. Pruitt. You are most welcome to watch. Moreover, you are welcome to join us if you so desire. We're always looking for new recruits.
Young Robert Coates is beaming, almost walking on air. He pauses between scenes to reapply the black to his face. I see you are playing Othello.
It is my honor to do so, yes.
It must be trying to constantly reapply.
It is all part of the magic, is it not? The makeup, the lavish costumes, all meant to transport the audience to worlds distant in time and place.
The costumes are definitely lavish, made possible, I can only guess, by Daddy's purse strings. I've done a little theatre myself, Mr. Coates, and was wondering...
Then you must join us, surely. Your accent will be small impediment.
A very kind offer, Mr. Coates, but my associates and I, alas, we are only passing through.
Oh, more's the pity.
But I'm curious, you are still in early rehearsals, you say?
Very true, Mr. Pruitt. Well spotted.
So why the need for full dress and makeup at this point, especially when one considers the heat?
Truly, Mr. Pruitt? As a thespian yourself, you ask this? Can you expect Othello to truly be Othello if he does not dress as Othello? Does not look like and speak as Othello? It's all one, sir.
Method acting.
Did you ever consider looking for an actual Moor to play the part?
Wherever would one find a Moor, Mr. Pruitt?
Or a black person, a Negro?
What an extraordinary idea.
Well, there is a great pool of talent to choose from, is there not?
Our plantation workers, mean you? Most cannot even speak English. Pidgin English at best, Mr. Pruitt.
By now, overhearing Robert's happy exclamations, most of the troupe have joined us, eager to follow the conversation.
Do you think, Mr. Pruitt, that Mr. Shakespeare employed an actual Moor for the part? Richard Burbage, more like, don't you think?
It was Burbage. He's got you there, Fred.
And should you ever hear of a production where an actual Moor plays the part, I should be extremely keen on knowing.
After a tea break, the actors resume the rehearsal, picking it up in Act 2, Scene 1. Are you getting this, Linda?
Definitely. Camera's just behind that cactus-looking thing in the back. Oh my gosh, look at them. The acting's, well, what would you call it exactly?
Dreadful?
And they seem to feed off each other's dreadfulness.
Oh, here he comes. The one day to be famous Mr. Robert Coates.
Oh, my fair warrior.
Why does he thrust his arm in the air?
My dear Othello.
Desdemona, too. It must be contagious.
It gives me wonder great is my content to see you here before me. Oh, my soul's joy.
More arm thrusting. Maybe it's a West Indian thing.
If after every tempest come such calms, May the winds blow till they have wakened death, and let the laboring bark climb hills of seas Olympus high.
Arms up again, both of them this time.
And duck again as low as hell's from heaven.
Uh-oh, watch out, Desdemona.
If it were now to die.
Easy with that squeeze, Mr. Coates. You're not supposed to kill her till the last act.
'Twould now to be most happy, for I fear my soul hath her content so absolute that not another comfort like to this succeeds in unknown fate.
Thank God. Finally, Desdemona can breathe.
The heavens forbid, but that our love and comfort should increase, even as our days do grow.
Do they smile without a break?
Amen to that, sweet powers. I cannot speak enough of this content. It stops me here. It is too much of joy.
And so they kiss.
A tender moment.
A brotherly peck on the neck. How sweet. Ah, but here comes fresh blood, Iago.
Oh, you are well too now, but I'll set down the pegs that make this music, as honest as I am.
Scowling when you should be smiling ironically, right?
Interesting take.
And so it continues, with more overacting and inexplicable deviations from the text, until finally the second act is done. Done on so many levels.
No one's eager to return to their fatherly overseers.
Do you think we could interview them? They already live in a fantasy world. A mic and camera's not going to be much of a stretch.
Game's on.
So, you're writing a book on amateur theatre? How delightful.
I smile and do my best to speak Regency. Collecting material at this point, not quite sure of the eventual format.
Ah, I see. Research, then.
Pretty much. Linda has already explained about the video camera and Janet the microphone. Without exception, the actors seemed unperturbed by these alien devices. Please tell me your name and role.
My name is Reginald Fairfax, and I play the villainous Iago, a most delicious part.
How long have you been involved in theatre here in Antigua?
3 years now. It was Robert who first got me interested.
Robert Coates?
Oh, yes, indeed. Who else? Robert is altogether the centerpiece of the troupe. Splendid fellow. And the costumes he manages to assemble for us. Altogether top shelf. Of course, Robert prefers to play the protagonist, so it's left to people like me to do Iago and such. I have a rather fetching sneer, I am told.
And when is the first performance scheduled for?
In 3 weeks' time. We expect an audience of at least 50 people. All the island's hoi polloi.
I'm sorry we'll miss it.
Time for the next one, Fred.
Oh, yes, Mr. Pruitt. I just love playing Desdemona. Imagine little Angela Sanders doing Shakespeare here on a small island in the West Indies. Of course, it's a very English thing to do, ain't it?
And now that you mention it.
And don't you just adore my dress? I have no idea where Robert managed to find such gorgeous material. I feel so much the part when I wear it.
Miss Sanders, I've not yet seen your death scene, but I can only imagine it is rather traumatic for an actress. How do you feel about doing the scene with Mr. Coates?
Oh, indeed, Mr. Pruitt. It is the highlight of the play. A moment of such trauma, as you say, and such tragedy. Robert and I have been working very hard on it, wanting to get it just right.
A fellow smothers you with a pillow, I believe.
Heavens, no, Mr. Pruitt. That would be far too violent.
Then how?
With words, Mr. Pruitt.
I'm quite sure the script calls for a pillow.
Such is the power of the bard's words, Mr. Pruitt, that they can make an actor faint straight away. Under the right circumstances, even expire. You will remember, Mr. Pruitt, that Othello accuses me, quite wrongly, of adultery, holding before him a handkerchief, which he presents as damning evidence. All a terrible misunderstanding, concocted by Iago, played most handsomely by our dear Reggie.
Angela interrupts her thought by throwing a kiss to Reggie, who, not surprisingly, returns it with gusto.
Now, where was I, Mr. Pruitt? Ah, yes. Robbie clutches the handkerchief in one hand, then throws me to the bed. It is a very dramatic scene. And then he says to me, despite my protestations of innocence, "Down, strumpet, it is too late." And that is the moment when I expire. Shall I show you?
I'm sorry.
The false accusation strikes me so deeply.
There is only so much radio can convey, not, for example, the fact that it is at this point that Miss Sanders slaps a fist to her breast, which I can only think was a gesture fervently recommended to her by Mr. Coates.
That my heart quite breaks, and I die on that very spot. Like this.
And again, words will hardly suffice as I watch Miss Angela Sanders shut her eyes, tilt back her head, and thrust the back of her hand to her forehead before letting out a faintly rodent-like cry. Oh, I see, Miss Sanders. Yes, most dramatic.
It is a moment of deep tragedy, Mr. Pruitt. I should not be surprised if there is weeping in the audience.
Your performance, Miss Sanders, I am sure, will elicit deep emotions.
Let's keep it moving, Fred.
A pleasure, Mr. Pruitt. My name is Arthur Cunningham, and I play the much-misused Cassio.
By most accounts, Mr. Cunningham, Othello is a challenging play for an amateur troupe.
Well, Mr. Pruitt, when does an Englishman walk away from a worthy challenge? Need look no further than our illustrious Lord Nelson.
So you have no qualms about tackling such a...
None whatsoever, sir. Last year we did Romeo and Juliet, Robert's favorite play, by the way. And next year we planned about Macbeth.
How would you describe your working relationship with Mr. Coates?
Oh, first rate, Mr. Pruitt. It is extraordinary the expertise Robert brings to these plays. With all due respect to the bard, on occasion, Shakespeare's plays sometimes need a little sprucing up.
I'm not sure I understand.
Robbie is quite good at writing verse, or speaking it extempore when called on.
Oh, great. I know.
So, Mr. Coates will sometimes add his own lines to a scene?
Or sometimes remove them, depending on the need. Help move things along, you understand.
You're getting all this?
Absolutely.
Oh, one more thing, Mr. Cunningham. How would you rate Mr. Coates as an actor?
How else to describe Robert's stage work but as, well, unforgettable? It leaves an impression, sir.
Back in Toronto, it seems winter will never end. We stand shoulder to shoulder in the drafty kitchen, oven door open to add more heat. Janet speaks wistfully as we begin reviewing our tropical footage.
Palm trees. I want to go back. Linda, what the hell?
Somehow, Linda has managed to record slaves at work. Only from a distance and sometimes out of focus, all the same.
What if they saw you?
Relax, Janet. I think they had other things on their mind.
I have to agree with Linda. 3 white people walking up a hill would probably register on a slave's mind less than a fly landing on a bare arm. One he could swat, the other he could not. Janet lets the issue go and returns her attention to the screen.
Good work, Fred. The interviews turned out well.
They took to the mic and camera like it was just another tube in their makeup kit.
Never underestimate an actor's vanity.
At any rate, I think we got what we wanted. A sense of Robert Coates's, what should we call it, dedication.
And his fashion sense. What must they have thought about our outfits?
They must have thought we were savages. Well, you at any rate, Fred.
We head back to the living room. Janet and I sit on one end of our recently acquired second-hand sofa. Linda sits opposite in a chair that once belonged to my Nonna Francesca. Linda is fidgety because there are no wagon wheels left, and Janet seems bored. It seems to me that the big question is, should we actually try to film Robert Coates in the act?
In the act of what?
In the act of acting.
But isn't that the whole point?
Janet's cat has walked into the room and decides to hop into Linda's lap.
How do you make a documentary about the world's worst actor without actually showing him acting?
Yes, but Janet, I don't think we'll ever be able to actually capture that. Maybe the odd flood scene, the missed line, tripping on some scenery, but the totality of what Robert Coates was, that will be hard to capture. I've never heard a cat purr louder than Janet's.
What are you thinking, Janet?
I can tell Janet is working the problem in her head. No one speaks for quite a while.
The greatest horror is off-screen horror.
Yes, Janet, exactly what I'm getting at.
The shadow of the killer, but not the killer.
Yes, yes.
And the shadow in this case?
What we're looking for, I think, is what Robert's peers say about him. Members of the audience, theater managers, that kind of thing.
So what makes R.C. bad is not his actual acting, but what people say about his acting?
Exactly. I get on my feet and start to pace. That's what we're all like, don't you think? Whether we want to admit it or not. Much easier to believe the critics than our own eyes.
But Fred, people flocked to the theaters to see R.C. with their own eyes.
True, but only to reinforce an opinion they already had. But what really is key here is that we let the audience's imagination do the brunt of the work. Let the shadow mind do its job, because no acting can be quite as bad as the bad acting in one's imagination.
But we have to show some footage of R.C. on the stage. I mean, we already have the rehearsal shots.
Okay, Linda, some, but only a suggestion. Shadows of a knife on a shower curtain, that kind of thing. I keep pressing the comparison because I know how much Linda admires Hitchcock, the filmmaker, not the man. I end by putting a sympathetic hand on her shoulder. Janet's cat growls at me. Last thing we want, Linda, is our viewers saying, well, his acting wasn't that bad. We sleep in till almost noon, until Janet's cat starts walking back and forth across our faces. We've hardly put on the coffee when we hear someone at the door.
So where to today, boss?
Neither Janet nor I have any intention of making decisions about anything until we've had our coffee. Linda waits patiently. To her credit, she's brought scones. Finally, Janet manages more than a mumble.
1809.
Sorry?
That's when R.C. heads back to London.
I refill Janet's cup, encouraging her to elaborate. She explains that R.C.'s father had died 2 years earlier, and Robert had stayed in Antigua only long enough to tie up family affairs and arrange for someone to look after the plantation in his absence.
Then it's back to England's verdant shores with a very generous inheritance in his pocket. He heads straight to Bath.
What's in Bath?
It's the place where anybody who's anybody likes to strut his stuff.
Peacock City, then.
Pretty much. And most importantly, there's the Theatre Royal.
So what? R.C. just shows up at the theater door and they...
Why don't we go and find out?
What date should I set the Wayback Machine to?
The what?
Rocky and Bullwinkle, the Wayback Machine, Mr. Peabody. Oh, Janet. What year did you say?
I better make it 1810. Let's give Mr. Coates a chance to settle in first, and me a chance to get dressed. Fred, did you get those costumes from your Stratford friend?
I smile and nod. I'm quite looking forward to seeing Janet wearing a corset. When we arrive in Bath, Robert Coates is already well known, a man about town, a leader in fashion, and notorious for his appearances on stage at the Theatre Royal. At Janet's suggestion, we visit York House, where we meet a Mr. Price Gordon.
Of course, Mr. Pruitt. Only too happy to reminisce about my good friend.
To my surprise and relief, having a microphone hovering over one's head seems but a minor inconvenience, both here and in the Caribbean. Being the center of attention seems to trump everything, especially in Bath.
I think it fair to say, Mr. Pruitt, that it fell first to me the privilege of introducing Mr. Coates to the greater world. We both took rooms here at York House and would often see each other at breakfast.
So he struck you at once as an accomplished actor?
He did, sir, although I cannot say he stuck always strictly to the text.
You are not the first to say so, Mr. Gordon.
So, returning to your question, Mr. Pruitt, that first morning I took the liberty of correcting a passage from Romeo and Juliet. Very good, sir, I said to him, well rendered, though I believe that is not quite the text as I remember it. To which Mr. Coates replied, not in the least offended, I thank you, sir. I have the play by heart, but I think I have improved upon it with these alterations.
Mr. Gordon Price is a man who needs no prompting.
Well, sir, what can one say? I bowed in submission, acknowledging I was not a profound critic, and complimenting him again on his rendition. This led to an extended conversation where we discussed at length the merits of this fine tragedy.
Mr. Methuen, I said, he has recently made a great noise here in Bath. A first-rate performer, much like yourself, sir. I doubt not that the Bath public is ready for such another.
Fascinating, Mr. Gordon. Please continue.
Well, this single fact seemed to light a fire under my companion, who instantly sat upright and declared that he was ready at any time to play the role of Romeo before a Bath audience. As I have already mentioned, Mr. Gordon,
he said to me,
I have a costume at the ready. It is in fact adorned with diamonds. All that is wanting is an introduction to the theatre manager. So, of course, I told Mr. Coates that I would be happy to arrange an introduction. But so eager was he to put his plan in action that he rose from the table and headed directly for the theatre to speak with the manager directly.
So that was the start of Mr. Coates's theatrical career.
Never anything quite so straightforward as that, sir. Within the hour, Mr. Coates returned, full of wrath and indignation. I am unaccustomed to being treated so rudely, he cried. He lifted his cane and aimed it in a truly offensive attitude at a nearby wall. Be at peace, Mr. Coates, I said. I will call the manager myself. I shall make short work of his misapprehension, after which I am confident he will be but too happy to receive you on his boards.
Finally, Mr. Gordon pauses for a breath, then pats his belly. I turn to Linda to make sure she's getting all this.
60%.
We have only so much battery power, so we have to be careful. And all was well after your meeting with Mr. Diamond?
These things must be handled with delicacy, Mr. Pruitt, as I'm sure you understand. I first consulted Lady Belmore and some other ladies of note in the city. They were all most curious, and I dare say even excited as I shared with them the story of Mr. Coates. Very shortly, a large party of gentlemen and ladies, principally ladies, had agreed to fill the lower boxes of the theatre. With this assurance in hand, Mr. Diamond had no difficulty scheduling a performance of Romeo and Juliet for the week following. A gentleman of fashion, the posters read, will make his debut appearance on the English stage in a performance of Romeo and Juliet.
And Mr. Coates's debut performance was well received? Mr. Gordon doesn't answer at once. He smiles and again pats his belly.
I made certain many dozens of friends were planted in the pits, who, together with the large party in the lower boxes, broke out into loud applause the moment Mr. Coates walked out on stage. Mr. Pruitt, I have an idea. Would you care to speak to some of the players in the performance?
Better and better.
I fear Robert is in Brighton at present, but Miss Jameson is a good friend of mine. She played Juliet. I'm sure I could persuade her to come and visit.
That would be wonderful, sir.
And the nurse as well, played quite admirably by Mrs. Groves. Would you care to speak with her?
Both Mrs. Groves and the much younger Miss Jameson are dressed in the very costumes they had worn on stage at the Theatre Royal. A gift from Mr. Coates, they explain. So good of you to make time to see us.
Our pleasure.
I'm afraid we missed Mr. Coates's debut performance. We've heard stories of the event, of course, from Mr. Gordon, among others, but we're most grateful for this chance to hear directly from two of the principals.
And it's about time we got a woman's point of view.
Rolling.
So, in general, ladies, how was the experience? Mrs. Groves and Miss Jameson look at each other, seeming to wonder who should speak first. What was it like working with Mr. Coates?
Oh, it was lovely.
Lovely costumes, as I'm sure you can see, Mr. Pruitt.
And Mr. Coates's costume, Mr. Pruitt, it was simply spectacular, wasn't it, Mrs. Groves?
He wore a spangled cloak of sky blue silk, almost too bright to look at, and crimson pantaloons besides.
And a great Spanish hat trimmed with white feathers.
And don't forget, love, the ornament upon the hat.
Oh, yes.
With diamonds sewn right upon it. Diamonds also on his knee and shoe buckles. Actual diamonds, Mr. Pruitt.
A glittering spectacle, I can well imagine. Young Miss Jameson, Juliet, is quite beaming now.
What was your word, Miss Singleton? Stunning. Mr. Coates was very stunning.
Yet, would it be fair to say Mr. Coates was not outfitted in the traditional Romeo costume?
And now that I think upon it, that may explain the apple cores and the orange peels.
I beg your pardon?
Which they threw on stage when Romeo made his entrances.
But not always, Mrs. Groves.
No, love, true enough. The first act was fine. There was some hissing, though.
Only a little.
Mostly the hissing came later, along with cries of, "Off, off!"
They shouted this at Mr. Coates?
Only a portion of the audience, Mr. Pruitt. A very small but regrettably loud portion.
They were most rude.
I must agree, Mrs. Groves.
Mr. Coates was not at all what they expected, I suppose, so they simply would not abide him.
And Mr. Coates, how did he react to all this? The orange peels, the hissing?
He carried on as if he did not even hear them.
Nevertheless, it was extremely rude, and sometimes it was hard to hear one's cues. It was particularly bad during the balcony scene.
Which is my favorite.
Mrs. Groves begins to relive the scene, waving her arms and frowning.
For a while, Mr. Pruitt, a kind of battle ensued, with the larger, properer part of the audience hissing down the ruffians, and then the ruffians hissing back.
And still Mr. Coates soldiered on.
Remember the end of Act 4, Mrs. Groves?
I do, love.
How Mr. Coates folded his arms and stared defiantly up at those ruffians.
Just as you say.
And then the curtain fell, and thunderous applause rose from the rest of the audience.
Mr. Coates gave as good as he got, Mr. Pruitt.
And so, by the end of the play, had the hooligans, ruffians, as you call them, finally been silenced?
We did not reach the end of the play, Mr. Pruitt.
Those awful malcontents, they were at it again. Romeo had just arrived at the tomb and was trying to open it with a crowbar.
A crowbar?
Which, for some reason, sent the rabble into a frenzy of hoots and hollers, and one could hardly hear oneself speak. The rabble were shouting as loudly as they could, and the rest of the audience were shouting for quiet. But none of this stopped Romeo. He staunchly carried on and pried open the entrance to Juliet's tomb.
It was then that Mr. Diamond brought down the curtain.
Was it worth it, then, having to put up with all that?
Oh, indeed it was, sir, and Mr. Coates was ever the gentleman.
The worst of all time. You have been listening to the voices of Brian Dion as Fred, Fran Patterson as Janet, Karen Agnew as Linda, and Richard Robery as Robert Coates. Additional voices from Michael Pearce, Bruce Ormond, Joanne Turner, Robin Lamb, Eli Geddes, Brad Ferguson, Mary DeFeo, David Edgington, and Laurie Jarvis.